Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. Today, I'm excited to be once again joined by Bill Williams, the best-selling author of The Electric Life, as we explore how small shifts in mindset can lead to big transformations. In this episode, we'll discuss why reframing mistakes as mistakes fuels creativity, how to balance positivity with mindfulness through positivity, and the art of making your team feel truly valued. Plus, we'll uncover how the power of authentic giving, deep listening, and letting go of what no longer serves us is your true superpower. So whether you're a leader or simply seeking personal growth, this episode is packed with actionable insights to energize your journey. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. Well, let's talk about another issue that I know is so critical for leaders, that they don't like to make mistakes. Failure is frowned upon. And another guest on the podcast had the same insight as you did, Matt Abrahams. He said, look at mistakes as mistakes, like in Hollywood. Reshoot the scene. It's just a missed opportunity. Don't let it take on too much weight. Mistakes, not mistakes, are chances and opportunities for learning, and take however many you need to make sure that learning happens.
Yeah. For me, it's only a failure if we did not learn something from it. But I invite people to get excited. Everybody has a smartphone. I've got mine handy somewhere here. And, I ask people all the time, what smartphone am I on? And they'll say, well, you're on an iPhone. And I'm like, yeah, but no, I'm a little embarrassed to say, I'm waiting for a good sale to come on very soon. I'm on an iPhone 11. There's an iPhone 16 right now. Could you imagine if Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak and the Apple team did not release the iPhone until the 16 was ready? Where would we be today? They invented the touchscreen glass, which is now out there in the public domain. And so how do we celebrate those takes? Now, I'm not saying, let your people fall off the cliff. Don't allow them to make a career limiting move. But, anytime things don't go exactly as you hoped, review it. Press the pause button, rewind it, and try to find out, what could you do to make it even better next time? Heck, you know what, Charles? Even if things went exactly as you had planned for them to go, that is now the new expectation. So what can you and your team do to raise the bar? How can you celebrate that take? And rather than it being a mistake, it was a great take. But what are you going to do to iterate? What are you going to do to continuously improve? Because your customers are going to expect you to. Internally or externally, they're going to be looking for you to improve. So celebrate those moments. Get used to looking for opportunities to improve. Be okay with what it is today. There will be other iterations of this project, this program. But how can you make it better and better every time?
When you have a great story with Sir Ken Robinson, he has the most viewed TED Talk of all time, wonderful human being, a lot of insights in his work, but I'd love for you to kind of go through that story with our listeners and just kind of how this really is an example of making mistakes and just reframing it as mistakes.
He is all about education, without question. Sir Ken Robinson, so many stories with him, having the honor and privilege to work with him. But in one case, we had him coming to an event here in Toronto, Canada. And I don't know that all of your listeners would know, but Sir Ken Robinson overcame polio as a young person. And with that, he had some challenges for his mobility. Now, he didn't feel comfortable really in a wheelchair, but he had no problem getting into a scooter. And so we had made arrangements to get him from his hotel to the conference venue. And sure enough, the arrangements fell through. And he wasn't picked up. So luckily, he just had the proactivity to just hop in an Uber, get to the conference facility. They had made arrangements for there to be a scooter for him there, but sure enough, they didn't have the scooter ready. They had a wheelchair. So we had our very first speaker come out on stage, and that's all we had. But all of a sudden, as the host of the event, I got the notice that Sir Ken Robinson was running late. And with that, the stage manager said, well, Bill, just go out there and fill. Just you fill. And when Sir Ken Robinson is here, I'm like, how will I know? Like, I don't have communication in my ear. I'm hearing you today through the communication in my ear, but I had nothing. I was on the stage, if you will, naked. And so I asked everybody to stand up with your partner and talk about the key insights you had. And the agreement with the stage manager is that when Sir Ken Robinson arrived, there was a sponsor that was going to introduce him, and they would put the 5 minutes that sponsor had would show up on a countdown clock in front of us. That's how on stage we know when we're supposed to get the heck off the stage. So sure enough, that was the plan. And I was filling and things were going well. I was riffing and talking about things just from my heart. It was all going really well. And all of a sudden on the countdown timer, Charles, 5 minutes didn't show up. 30 minutes showed up. We'd only had one speaker before that was 45 minutes. How am I going to fill 30 minutes with that? So now, luckily, with my book, I have my talk ready to go anytime if that ever happens again. But Sir Ken was there and he showed up. And so we really had the opportunity to celebrate that miss-take, learn from him, continually improve. But yeah, what a powerful, powerful speaker about education and not just arithmetic, not just reading and writing, but also the arts and how powerful and important the arts are, according to Sir Ken Robinson and the work that he'd done.
Curious about how organizations create these environments where they really kind of promote psychological safety, where failures are celebrated, because I just don't see this enough in many organizations. It's really looked down upon, frowned upon. But Project Aristotle by Google in the 2012, kind of started this. Amy Edmondson and her great work with psychological safety, but it's still not ingrained in many organizations. What's a few steps that they can take, possibly leaders can take, to really build this in their company?
Great question. It is challenging. I really think it's important to, if you will, frame the work. And with that, in framing the work, it is, as leaders, we should be able to, articulate what good performance looks like. So the simple one for me is an acronym that I work with, that it's just simply Dr. STAR. And in framing the work with my people, the DR of doctor simply stands for, what are the desired results? What's the project at hand here? What am I asking you to do? The next step is to be able to communicate to your direct reports. The S in Dr. Stars, what are the standards? What are the standards that I expect you to achieve? Now, in some industries, there's actually, governing bodies that you must meet the minimum requirements for. In other cases, it's just, what does good performance look like that meets my expectations, exceeds my expectations, consistently exceeds my expectations? So, the DR, desired results, S in Dr. Star is the standards. And from there, Charles, what I invite leaders to do is to really just turn that form around, slide it across the table, and now ask the rest of the acronym. The T stands for, what are the tools that you need in order to deliver those desired results to those standards? What time do you need? What budget do you need? What people do you need? What technology do you need? What are all the tools that you need? How will we be accountable to each other and how often? So that I'm not checking up on you. We have an agreement for when we're going to check in with each other and make sure that we're delivering the results. And all of it leads to the R in Dr. Star, which is, what's the reward for you for doing a great job? Or the other side of it might be, what's the damage to your reputation? So Dr. Star, desired results, standards, tools, accountability, and results. Now, with that, I also challenge people, similar to Dr. Amy Edmondson, where she really talks about having that speak up culture. So how do you create that safe space for people to be able to share their thoughts and feelings? And I've already talked about, my definition of honesty is speaking the truth, but also being open with your ideas. So I think those are some really critical things, but also to really, as we're checking in with people to see how they're doing, letting them know that these are going to be iterations. Like, the only failure, which is not an option, if you remember Apollo 13, failure is not an option. It's only a failure when we don't learn. So what are we learning from this, and how will we make sure that it never happens again? There's a famous old legend of Jack Welch in his day at GE, where he had a senior leader that made an incredibly expensive mistake. And that leader had packed up his box of his football helmet, his baseball picture, I can see behind you as well, packed up all their belongings into their box and went down to meet with Jack Welch and said, okay, I know it, like I'm here to let me go. And that's going to happen. And Jack's response was, do you remember what he said?
I don't.
No, he said, why would I let you go? You have just made $1 billion mistake that I know you will never, ever make again. Like, that was an investment. Now, thankfully for me, I'm not in the world of making $1 billion mistakes. So it's just really celebrating those. And what I did with my team, Charles, it became really quite funny. We had 2 awards on a monthly basis. We had one award that looked like the Oscar. So when, famous major motion pictures win the Oscar, that was for the best performance. So it was the best performance award, and everybody got that. But Charles, we had another award that was the hind end of a horse. And what my team did was they would actually, we never had to appoint that award. There was always somebody would go and just grab it off of somebody else's desk because they realized I just made a take. I just screwed up and I've earned this horse's hind because I made a mistake, but we made it fun. We made it funny. But more importantly, the question is, what did we learn from that? And what will we not do again next time based on having learned this lesson? So I think we can almost gamify it and make it fun for our teams, but let it be known that we will make a difference, that we will stand behind each other, we'll support each other, we'll be there for each other. And it's okay so long as we're learning. And that's the Institute for Management Studies. It's all about learning, right?
Absolutely. There's another great example with Alan Mulally when he went to Ford and everyone didn't want to, and there was no celebration of failure. And he really was trying to turn around that culture to get them to celebrate failure, to understand, it's okay to make mistakes. Let's move on. Because the other big issue with a lot of leaders is what you call toxic positivity. That forces this false positivity. They're not really managing the situation or the problem. They're saying everything's wonderful when it's really not. And in this day and age where mental health issues are so predominant and we're still not really acknowledging the full scope of those, we shouldn't be pretending that everything's okay. It may sound innocuous on the surface, but it can have a significant impact on us internally for trust with others and in our overall mental health.
Yeah, without question. This one, I have to admit, Charles, this one's been a hard lesson for me. It really anchored for me about 5 years ago. I was with my father, Colin Harold Williams, an incredible man who was that electrician by trade and just embraced me in my life and everything that I have done to this point in time. And he had been diagnosed with brain cancer. And so my sister and I were there to care for him. And every month I would travel from Ontario to British Columbia, which is basically New York to LA. And I would be with him for 10 days. And my sister and brother-in-law would do the other 20 days of the average 30-day month. And it was getting closer and closer to the end. And we would take Dad to the Dairy Queen and get a sundae. He loved his chocolate sundae, but he would make such a mess with that we converted him from chocolate to butterscotch because the butterscotch didn't dribble as much. And he would have a big sort of napkin, a tea towel, my mother would call it, to protect his clothes. And at times at dinner, he would spill his beverage or, make crumbs all over the place. And we'd constantly say, Dad, it's okay. Dad, it's okay. It's okay. Don't worry about it. It's okay. And finally, one day he said to me, Charles, whoa. He said, Billy, it's not okay. I'm dying. It's a moment like that you realize it's that toxic positivity. Oh, everything's great. Everything's fine. Everything's wonderful. It's not. And when we can just connect with that other human being in that time and just hold space for them, even if we just sit there in silence, just that presence with that individual can make a significant difference. Now, whether that's at work or whether that's at home, obviously my example here is at home, but we all have these things that are going on with us and times that we, potentially get incredibly emotional about. And, it's interesting. Before, if somebody cried at work, we would get very uncomfortable about that. But a recent study has come out that says we're not so, uncomfortable when somebody sheds a tear at work. But if somebody has an angry outburst at work, that we're becoming more uncomfortable with. And quite frankly, I'm glad to see that. Let's allow human beings to be the being part of that human. But the inappropriate angry outbursts, those aren't appropriate. Use your emotional intelligence. Use your 4 S's: self-awareness. How happy, sad, glad, mad, angry, fine is not a feeling. And then how do you regulate that emotion? What's appropriate? The 3rd S is social awareness. And Charles, we've all heard this before. It's read the room. And then finally, social regulation. So, in an appropriate moment, it's okay to become emotional, but it's not okay to have, regulate yourself about any kind of an outburst. So that was a lot. Thanks, Charles, for taking me back there. It's great to have the connection back to Dad again, even in that moment.
Well, yeah, and really at work, like you say, it's having that time to just reflect and pause. Because if it's something that you feel uncomfortable with, you don't want to just spew out something. You don't want to retaliate. We don't create enough pauses in our day to really reflect on life, on insights, and many leaders are in execute mode all the time. especially when they're talking to other people. They're not pausing, they're not engaging, they're not being present. And don't give a present to someone, like you say, be present with them. That shows them that you care, and having that time for just to pause in your day for your own self-reflection, but also when you're talking to others before you respond harshly, especially to negative people, can really help many relationships and make you a more effective leader.
It's interesting because this micro step, I refer to it as practicing positivity. And so press the pause button, but rewind it, because too often we're watching that experience through our own life and we're making judgments about that other individual, and we're probably being self-absorbed. So even think about the last time you got cut off in traffic. What did you do? What did you say inside your own car, whatever the case may be? And we don't know what's going on in that individual's world. I just saw a video yesterday where there is a young woman pulls into a grocery store parking lot in a beautiful little white convertible car. And a woman says to her, "Wow, nice car." And she says, "Oh, thank you." And then walks into the store and buys a very few groceries. And she, goes to cash out, and she's using some form of food stamps. And the woman says to her, "Oh, great. Yeah, you're driving a sports car, but you're buying food with government subsidized funding." And the woman's humiliated, embarrassed, and just walks away without really saying anything. The story goes on. 20 minutes later, she gets home and she pulls into her neighbor's driveway and says, "Thanks for lending me the car and taking care of my son. I didn't have any other opportunity to go and buy groceries, and I didn't have the money to do it. I couldn't have done it." So too often we're self-absorbed and we're putting our own version of that movie forward. And there's another side to it. So I just invite us to really pause, rewind. Don't be so self-absorbed. Look for another perspective. And maybe again, go out and ask, how did you come to that? What did you come to? What caused that? Look at it from somebody else's perspective and really push hard for that, because it's not always easy.
And something I think everyone can learn from in these days, where there's just so much animosity, bitterness, hate in this world, is everyone we interact with should feel special, valued, and important.
Yeah, special. It's, for me, it's an acronym now. I call it SVI, treat people SVI. And so special simply means that we're all unique. We are all diverse in some way, shape, or form. You are not exactly like me. We're both men, but we both have grayish beards. You're doing a little bit better than me. I got more gray than you. But I don't have hair on my head. You got hair on your head. So we're different. We are special in that way. Beyond those things, though, what really makes your direct report special? What's a skill? What's an ability they have that you don't have? For me as a leader, Charles, what I've always done is I hire talent that is good at the things that I'm not good at. Neil Pasricha wrote The Happiness Equation. And he says, you can buy happiness. He says, hire people to do things you don't want to do. But so long as they're doing that while you're paying them to do it, you got to go do something that makes you happy. So we're all special, and we all have different skills and abilities. Valued for me is that they feel appreciated for that. So I challenge leaders to eliminate the word thank you from your vocabulary. Sounds like an interesting situation here, I hope. And I want to be a little bit controversial. It's almost impossible to eliminate the word thank you from your vocabulary. But what I mean by that, Charles, is you can buy a box of greeting cards that say thank you. Might be in 13 different languages, might have puppies and kittens on them. It might have glitter or sparkles or whatever. But thank you is a complete thought. So I find managers thank whoever you are for whatever you do around here. I don't know who you are and I don't know what you do, but I just wanted to thank you for your hard work. What was hard about the work? So I challenge people to replace thank you with I appreciate. And I appreciate is not a complete thought. So what is it that you appreciate? And what I find is that when we recognize people for very specific behaviors and contributions, those recognitions are the behaviors that get repeated. So we get more and more of that same thing we're looking for. I appreciate your attention to detail. I appreciate your customer focus. I appreciate your timeliness. What are the things that you appreciate from your team? And then when we're looking at the I important, it goes back to what your other speaker was saying. I want people to feel seen and heard. Seen, heard, understood, and compensated. And compensated isn't even necessarily financial compensation. It's, did you receive the recognition and the reward that you actually deserve for that contribution you made? So yeah, look at them as special, unique, valued, appreciated, and important, meaning seen, heard, and understood.
And you talk about also the law of reciprocity and giving it without expectation. How can that mindset transform workplace relationships?
Well, it's about not keeping track here, finally, Charles. Now is a time when I don't want you to keep the metrics. It's not about how many times did I do something for you versus how many times did you do something for me. If we take it back to our personal lives, Charles, I remember in school, we would have, in art class, we made some clay dishes. And, I thought I was making a beautiful clay dish for my mom. And it turned out that it was really ugly. It was not very good at all. But years and years later, when we were packing up mom's things, she's passed over as well, I found that that gift was still in the drawer. So what I realized is oftentimes the gift is actually in the giving. It's not in the receipt of that gift. And so, from reciprocity perspectives, when we give a gift, oftentimes people feel obligated to give us one back, but don't do it for that perspective. In the book, we talk about, in a restaurant, there was a study that was done. This is an influence, the psychology of persuasion. And, what they discovered is that if they delivered the bill to the table without any mints or candies, people gave a reasonable tip. If they gave the bill with candies, they would give a slightly bigger tip. But if they gave the bill without the gift of the candies, left, and came back and apologized and said, "I'm so sorry, I forgot to give you the candies, the gifts," that people gave an actual bigger tip. So from a reciprocity perspective, don't do it from a selfish perspective. Do it from what's the gift that I'm giving you. And don't expect anything in return for it. But you might be surprised when you come from that perspective, the return that you actually get for that small investment of recognizing your people.
Many leaders, the biggest challenge that you mentioned is for them to see themselves for who they really are, rather than what they pretend to be when they're out in front of people, whether that's at a meeting or a conference. Why is that so difficult for so many leaders?
Well, I think that our ego really gets in the way. And, from an egoic perspective, we want to be perceived as, great, the best, whatever the case may be. But for me, what I've found in my work, Charles, is that my ego is actually a gift. And it's letting me know the wounds that I still need to go back and heal, if you will. And so, how can you show up authentically as who you are and understand that you are enough as you are and who you are? So many of us suffer from imposter syndrome. It's women, men, we all suffer from imposter syndrome. And I kind of get excited about that now when I hear people, because it tells me, damn, you want to do a good job. You do really want to make a difference here. And you know what? You don't need to have a fancy degree or diploma on the wall. Your life experiences, in many cases, are all that you need. And how will you make a distinct contribution here? What difference will you make by showing up? And that's the power. That's really the big piece for me.
The final piece I want to get through just before we end our conversation today is really this story about the two monks, because this has some really deep implications. And I'll kind of just retell that story from what you give in the book. And then if you could unpack that and really how that impacts not only leaders, but everyone. So there was two monks traveling together. They arrived at a river with a strong current. As the monks prepared to cross the river, they saw an old, tired woman attempting to cross. The woman turned to the monks and asked them if they would kindly help her cross to the other side. The two monks glanced at one another. They made a solemn pact, however, that they would never touch a woman. Then, without a word, the older one picks up the woman, carried her across the river, and placed her gently on the other side and carried away without looking back. The younger monk couldn't believe what had happened. After catching his companion, he was speechless for an hour without a word between them. 2 more hours passed, then 3. Finally, the younger monk couldn't contain himself any longer, and he stated, "I cannot believe you picked up that woman and carried her across the river." He angrily confessed to his companion, "Why did you carry that woman on your shoulders?" The older monk looked at him and simply replied, "Brother, I set her down on the other side of the river hours ago. Why are you still carrying her?" Big lesson: retain your power. Don't carry someone else's burden.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, too often, one of my mantras because of this, Charles, has always been that I needed to protect my people from my boss. I need to protect my boss from my people. Because if my people didn't have my history has always been cleanups and startups. And a lot of those cleanups, people didn't have a good impression of my boss. And they would carry that with them throughout everything. They didn't want to contribute much or go above and beyond because of that, my boss. No, that's not good enough. I also remember times where I had told my boss something about one of my direct reports, and I would write their annual performance review back in those days. And my boss said, well, hold on a second. What about that time when they, and I'm like, why are you still carrying that? Like, we have moved on. No, I want that in the performance review. And so I'd be obligated to put it in. Charles suffered from an error in judgment in this last fiscal year's about as much as I was going to put down. People hold on to that stuff. And I think it's important to, so long as they've learned from it and it's not become a repetitive pattern for them, let's move on. Let's let it go. Don't carry somebody else's burden. Move on from that.
And when we hold on to these things that don't serve us, right, they take up that needed emotional space in our heads. So just let it go, like you said. Such a great conversation today, Bill. Thank you so much. Let our listeners know, what's the one thing that you would recommend that they start with going down this journey?
Number one for me would simply be self-awareness. Truthfully, honestly, how self-aware are you right now? Again, I think that so many of us are self-absorbed, but we need to move beyond being self-absorbed. Be self-aware and then begin to adapt and make some changes and truly authentically become the person and the leader that you always have wanted to be. The only thing that's holding you back right now is you. So be self-aware, figure out what your next steps are, learn and know what your strengths are, know what your blind spots are, your hidden talents and your blind spots. Create a plan and move forward. Start with self-awareness.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bill, for joining me today. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
Absolutely. You can always find me at Bill G. Williams on LinkedIn, or go to BillGWilliams.com, or take a look at my business, the B4Group.com. That's BFOURGROUP.com.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.